All right, so the couple of housekeeping stuff before we kind of get into it. I posted a couple announcements. So the exam went pretty well. Grades are about where I typically kind of see them even in a in-person class. So one thing that we'll do moving forward is for the next two exams, we're going to use the built-in kind of Respondus lockdown for locking down the browser. I want to make sure that it's working for everyone though, so I didn't use it on exam one, so I want to try to do a test run with it. So today's participation quiz, I'll mention this when we kind of go over at the end of class, is going to require that lockdown browser. So I'm not going to publish it until after class today because you can't actively have this open and Zoom. So today's in-class quiz, I'll have it set to release as soon as we're done today, so you can get on if you are here live and respond to it immediately after class. But it will require that lockdown browser. And it's a way that we can kind of make sure it's working for every single person. We run into any technical issues, we can get them out of the way now so that next Friday, which will be our second exam, we can, not have any of those concerns and we kind of get all those things ironed out before we get to that date. So with the holiday weekend, it was a little bit weird. Those first 2 weeks, we had the exam on a Thursday. From here on out, the exam will be on a Friday. We'll kind of still have a class period where we get to do review before it. And this week, we will start out with modules 5 and 6. So I've kind of combined modules 5 and 6. So the only one that you have to do a module reading for is module 6. So I usually would have that set to be due before we start covering that material in class. Here I've got it set to be due before we start class tomorrow. So we will do some module 6 material today. We'll finish it tomorrow, but because, the holiday weekend and I want to make sure everyone kind of has adequate time to get that module reading done, instead of being due today, it'll be due before we start class tomorrow. You also have that module 7 reading that's currently up there and available. That'll be set to be due before we start class on Wednesday. So we'll do modules 5 and 6 today, tomorrow, then module 7 Wednesday, Thursday, and then we'll start module 8 this Friday. Okay. So the module 8 reading will be set to release after we get through 5 and 6 tomorrow. Okay. Other than that, I also put up, and I didn't put it on the homepage because I didn't want to cause any confusion. But the module 5 reading, it's a lot, quicker than some of the other ones. It is up here on Canvas, and you can view module 5 on Top Hat. So we'll cover it very quickly today. But you can go in and look at those questions that are embedded into the text. It's just not due for any points. I had to set a due date to it, so I had it set to be the end of the day today. You should be able to kind of then review all the questions, have the answers starting tomorrow. But that module 5 reading is available. It's just not the one that's going to be counting for points. That's the module 6 reading due before we start class tomorrow. I also put up an announcement. I did have to do an exam regrade, which I had set. I ran through it yesterday on question, I think it was 24. The auto grade was not grading 24 correctly, so I had to go in, change some things, and it regraded it. That was the only question that ended up getting regraded. But if you haven't looked at your exam score since after you took it, those should be updated so that if you did get question 24 correct, it is now kind of adding those points in. Okay. Other than that, let me think. That should cover all the housekeeping stuff. Just to point out, if you do look at the assignments tab, I've got all of the module readings. You can kind of see they're being weighted by 4%, participation quizzes, the module quizzes, and now the exam is kind of being weighted 22%. So obviously this will change as the second midterm is over and the final. Those will kind of be the remaining, add up to 100% of the total grade. But your grade is currently being calculated almost as though like that exam score is because what you're going to get in the next two, right? Obviously, once we take them, then I'll put in the actual midterm exam too, and then Canvas will kind of regrade it accordingly. Okay. Okay. Any other questions before we jump into module? There it is, 5 and 6. So keep an eye on the chat here. Okay. And let me make sure, yeah, yes, the audio looks like it's working. So there's no other questions. We'll kind of jump right into module 5. And what we're going to be talking about is, and we kind of already used some of these terms before, but allocative efficiency. So back in module 2, we're looking at production possibilities curves. We said every point was production efficient, but only one point was allocative efficient. What did allocated efficiency mean? It's where the marginal benefit was equal to the marginal cost of the last unit. Or it was going to be the point where total economic surplus, and we haven't really used this term yet, but this allocated efficient point is going to be where total economic surplus is maximized. So we'll talk now, we looked at shortages and surpluses in the number of units. Economic surplus is really, you can think of it as like the net benefit of something, right? So we had, back in our old module 3 stuff, our demand curve was telling us the consumer's marginal benefit. The supply curve was telling us the producer's marginal cost. So the point where those two things were equal, right, where the supply was equal to demand, that was our equilibrium. So this equilibrium that we've been talking about is really the allocated efficient point for any market. So where supply is equal to demand, or the marginal benefit to the consumer of the last unit is the same as the marginal cost to the producer of the last unit, that's the allocated efficient point, right? So our equilibrium was this allocated efficient point. We're then going to talk about consumer and producer surplus. So consumer surplus is just the difference between the marginal benefit and the price paid for the goods. So why? So let's go, got this in the slides, but let's do some work on the .com here. So if I'm thinking about consumer surplus, and here I'm going to write it as consumer surplus. Really, we're talking about consumer economic surplus, as is probably a more technical way to say it. But for the sake of not having as much space filled, we'll just reference it consumer surplus. So it's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to consumers. So if we're looking at a market, quantity, price, we had our downward sloping demand curve. We said demand was reflecting the marginal benefit of every single unit for our consumers. What represented the marginal cost to a consumer? Well, that's going to be whatever price they pay. Okay? And we could even think about this as, well, what is that price? It's whatever that equilibrium price is of that good. So for every single unit here, you can think about it as, what is the consumer surplus from each unit? Well, from that first unit, the difference between the marginal benefit and the marginal cost, remember the demand curve tells us the marginal benefit, the marginal cost to the consumer is the price. This would be like the consumer surplus from the first unit. And this isn't going to be to scale, but just to give myself a little more room. If we then think about, okay, what about the second unit? Well, the demand curve is downward sloping. So the marginal benefit is going to be a little bit lower. The marginal cost to the consumer, though, is still just that equilibrium price. So the consumer surplus from the second unit is going to be a little bit smaller. Right? Now, we know that consumers will stop wherever that price hits the demand curve, because that would be where the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost for the consumer. If they were to go anywhere past this point, now the marginal benefit is below the marginal cost, they wouldn't be making decisions optimally or rationally, right? So we can think of like consumer surplus, that difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. I said another way of thinking about that is it's almost like the net benefit for every single unit, okay? So if we were to do that, thinking about every single unit there, I'll leave it up in case people are taking notes here. A more continuous depiction of that might be, so we had our equilibrium price here. At every single unit, here's the consumer surplus for all of these units. Total consumer surplus would be if we added all these up. So what is consumer surplus? It's going to be the area below our demand curve, but above that equilibrium price. So this is going to be the area of a triangle. Once we put some numbers to this, this should be pretty easy to calculate. Just 1/2 times base times the height. Okay. Any questions for you? Keep moving here. Okay. What if instead we were thinking about producers? Okay. So for producers, we're going to have a similar thing. If we think about what is producer surplus or economic surplus, that's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to producers. Well, what is the marginal benefit to producers? So if we're thinking about, we've got quantity, we've got price, we have our upward sloping supply curve, and then we have some equilibrium price. Well, remember, the price is the benefit to the producer. It's how much money they make when they sell something. What represents our marginal costs for the producers? Well, that was their supply curve. So you think about the net benefit to producers, or the producer surplus, is going to be at every single unit, what is the marginal benefit of that unit? It's the price they're charging. What's the marginal cost wherever we're at in the supply curve? So here, producer surplus is just that difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost, or the price and the supply curve. Now, if we continue to produce more, well, that marginal benefit or the price hasn't changed, but the marginal cost is now higher. So you can kind of see the producer surplus from each unit is getting smaller and smaller. Where do they stop? That point where the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost, or for them, that price is equal to the supply curve. Okay. So just like demand, we can look at this at like a per unit basis, but we can also think about a more continuous depiction, which would be something like, here's our supply curve, here's our equilibrium price. So here, producer surplus, for every unit, it's the difference between the marginal benefits or the price and the marginal cost represented by the supply curve. So we'll be adding all of these up. Producer surplus is the area below price, but above the supply curve. Once again, area of a triangle. So once we actually have some, a graph, we can actually calculate this 1/2 times base times the height. Okay. All right. So if we combine this, my lights got turned off. All right. So we've got consumer surplus, producer surplus. We can put all of this on the same graph and think about what total surplus is going to be. So we've got demand, supply, marginal costs, marginal benefits. So we just said whatever that equilibrium price is, consumer surplus was the area below demand but above that price, and producer surplus was the area below the price but above that supply curve. So what would total economic surplus be? Total surplus, you can think of it two different ways. It's just going to be the sum of producer and consumer surplus, or it's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost of every unit in the market. Well, for the market, if we don't care if it comes from consumers or producers, what represents our marginal benefits and our marginal costs? It's the difference between supply and demand. So total surplus would be for every unit, adding up that difference between the supply and demand curve. So total surplus would be this entire triangle, or just the sum of producer and consumer surplus. Okay. Any questions over anything there before we jump back into the slides here? See anything in the chat? Okay. All right. So basically, just kind of seeing it in a different light of what we just worked through. If I'm looking at consumer surplus, it's the sum of consumer surplus from every unit. So we said that was the area above the equilibrium price, but below our demand curve. kind of written more formally at every single quantity, starting from the first unit all the way to whatever that equilibrium quantity is, take the difference between the marginal benefits to consumers, or the demand curve, and their marginal cost, which is the price. And then for, so less technical area, below demand but above price. If we want to actually put some values to this, what would this look like? So let's say I had a current equilibrium price of 40. What would consumer surplus be here? Well, it's going to be the area below my demand curve, but above that equilibrium price. So how do I find the area of a triangle? Well, the height goes from 40 to 100, so 60. The base, it goes 0 to 50, so 50. So 50 times 60 times 1/2. Okay. So not a terribly tough calculation. We're just looking for the area of a triangle once we've identified where consumer surplus is. And then producer surplus, same kind of thing, just flipped, right? So now we're thinking about, for every single unit, starting with the first all the way to whatever that equilibrium quantity is, our producer surplus is the area below their marginal benefit or the price and above their marginal cost or the supply curve. So less technical, area below price but above supply. Okay. Once again, it's the area of a triangle. So if I had some, an equilibrium price in my supply curve, what would be producer surplus here? The area below price but above my supply curve is this triangle. So just what? 50 times 50 times 1/2 would give me that producer surplus of 1250. So I think that should be pretty easy, I think, to calculate these values once we actually have the numbers with them. It's more of identifying and kind of solidifying why consumer surplus is the difference between demand and the price, and why producer surplus is the difference between the price and the supply curve. Okay. Any questions for either of those? I'm going through a little bit quick, but I'm saving time for, I think, the stuff that's a little bit more difficult. So you can kind of think about it as like consumer and producer surplus, right? Why is there surplus on each unit? So think about, I paid 3,000, but I would have paid up to 4. Well, there my surplus is 1,000. Why? Because I would have paid an additional $1,000 than what the current equilibrium price is. So if we think about consumers here, the price being charged for this good is 40. Well, for those first 10 units, I would have been willing to pay what? $100, $95, $90, and I was only paying 40. So how much was I kind of benefiting, right, by buying these goods? Well, here was how much the benefit it was bringing me. Here's the cost. That difference between those, that was like the consumer's net benefit. Okay. So anytime, I've got a unit where the marginal benefit is above the price, that's a good thing for consumers, right? That generates some consumer economic surplus. For producers, they're paying, charging a price that's above what their current costs are. So they got $3,000. They would have done it for 1,000, right? Or in this example, for every unit here, I was receiving $70. I would have produced and sold this good in the market for 30, 35. So there, my net benefit as a producer would be that difference between the price I'm getting, that's the benefit to me, and how much I would have been willing to supply it at. That's kind of like my net benefit. Okay. So any market that's in equilibrium, whatever that equilibrium price is, for every single unit, right? Producers would have been willing to supply it for a lower price. Consumers would have been willing to buy it for a higher price. So both of them are going to be benefited, right? There's going to be a net benefit to both. Except for at this very last quantity, that equilibrium quantity, there, what would consumer and producer surplus be of the very last unit? Well, there the price is the same as the marginal benefit to consumers. So the very last unit, consumer surplus and producer surplus would be 0. Oh, not 6. 0. So we would say this is the point where they're indifferent, right? They're no better off or worse off buying this unit. Right? Every unit below that, we know there is some amount of surplus that exists to each one of these. Okay. All right. So we've got ourselves set up thinking about consumer, producer, total economic surplus. We're going to then think about government actions and how that's going to change what surplus is in the market, right? Or what impacts that will have in our market. So a couple of the government policies, price floors, ceilings, quotas. We should be able to get through price floors and ceilings today. We will likely start with quotas tomorrow. And then we also talked about some of this, and I kind of introduced this idea in earlier modules, just we weren't as detailed in talking about price floors and ceilings. I said it more as like the government sets this price. So we'll focus more on those here today. And then next class, we'll talk more about taxes and subsidies. We talked a little bit about those in some of the examples with things that shift supply and demand. We'll talk more about them here this week and how they would impact surplus. And then we're also going to think about when we have all of these things imposed, what's happening to consumer producer surplus, what's going to happen to total surplus, which introduces this new term, which is that anytime the government gets involved, generally, in most examples, it's going to cause lower total surplus, and the loss of surplus is what we're going to call deadweight loss. Okay? So deadweight loss is going to be the total surplus lost because of a government action. Okay? So if it's not kind of in this, this perfectly competitive, long, market equilibrium, right? Anything that pushes it away or out of that equilibrium, any government policy, that's going to create some loss of surplus or deadweight loss. And we'll identify that here as we start to work through the next two examples of price floors and price ceilings. So I think first we've got price ceilings. Okay. So the idea of a price ceiling is typically, it's kind of counterintuitive, but what a price ceiling does is it says if the current price is 100 and we don't want the price to be that high, we're going to only allow firms to charge, say, $70. You can't charge a price any higher than that. So it's a ceiling. It doesn't allow the price to go any higher than whatever it's set at. So examples, rent control is one that I'll kind of use here in the slides. It's a pretty popular one. You can also think about price ceilings, maybe in times of war. We want to make sure that the price of different materials we need for war, like back in World War II, they set aluminum and steel prices had price ceilings. But really, this could be any market. Right? A lot of the times, these are things that maybe are populist needs, but the price is currently way too high, kind of like rent, and so we try to limit what that price is. Okay. So we'll come back to this. But if I'm thinking about price ceilings, really got two types. Okay. So here's my supply curve. Here's my demand curve. So I'm going to go a little bit out of the order of the slides, and then we'll kind of touch on it in the slides here. Again, so we'll kind of see the same thing twice. So let's say that I had, well, let's do it this way. Let's say I imposed a price ceiling that was up here. Okay. So if I have a price ceiling, and just to put some values to this, let's say the current equilibrium price was 50. I tell people you can't charge a price any higher than 70. Well, what's going to happen? Well, you tell me I can't charge a price higher than 70. Currently, the price of this good that it's being sold for is 50. Okay, I'm not selling it for anything higher than 70. This would be an example of an ineffective price ceiling. And we'll talk more about why this could occur later on. But for now, anytime the price is set above the equilibrium, a price ceiling is set above the equilibrium price, it's not going to be effective. The whole goal of a price ceiling is to not allow the price to get up to the equilibrium, right? So an effective price ceiling is going to be any price ceiling set below that current equilibrium price, right? Now, once again, that seems kind of counterintuitive, right? But think of it as like this price ceiling doesn't allow the price to get up to that equilibrium. So something like 30, the current price is 50. I tell you, you can't charge a price any higher than 30. Okay, something's got to change. Right? That's an effective price ceiling. So if we have one of these effective price ceilings, what is that going to do to our markets? And then more specifically, some of the surplus values that we're looking at. Okay, so let's see. Got this idea on there. All right. Well, hopefully everyone gets this down. Let's see if I can. There we go. So let's think about what an effective price ceiling is going to do. Okay. So if I've got my supply curve, my demand curve, you kind of think about here's the equilibrium price, here's my equilibrium quantity. If I have an effective price ceiling, we said that has to be set below the current equilibrium price. So what is that going to do to my consumer and producer surplus? Well, remember before, in fact, let me have this as a side by side. We said before, consumer surplus would have been the entire area above that equilibrium price and below our demand curve. Producer surplus was the area below price but above our supply curve. So if this is the new price, right, after the price ceiling, for every unit here, notice the marginal cost to producers is now above what they can sell it for or above their marginal benefit. So will they produce these and supply them to the market? No, because now that price or their marginal benefit is below their marginal costs, right? So all of these units will no longer be supplied. The new quantity after this price ceiling is going to be lower than what the equilibrium quantity was. So now, what producer surplus is gained from every single unit up to this point? Well, that would just be the difference between the producer's marginal benefit, which is the price, and the producer's marginal cost. So our producer's surplus, less technical, but it's still the triangle on the bottom, right? It's just that now it's going to be a much smaller triangle. Or producer surplus where the price ceiling is going down. Now, what about consumers? Well, the new quantity is right here. It's kind of dictated by the fact that none of these units are being supplied anymore. So consumer surplus, it was the area below our demand curve, but above the equilibrium price. Well, the equilibrium price is no longer the price because of this price ceiling. So now the difference between the marginal benefit to the consumers and their marginal cost, which is the price, is now this entire area here. So they've lost a little bit, but they've gained this portion in the middle. I'll have a different depiction in the slides here, but basically this area here represents what used to be producer surplus and has now become consumer surplus. Right? And we'll work through this with some calculations, but you can kind of visually see the area lost is much smaller than the area gained. So when a price ceiling, we generally see that consumer surplus goes up. And this is pretty intuitive, right? What does an effective price ceiling do? It lowers the price. Well, who is that a good thing for? Consumers, so we see consumer surplus go up. Who is that a bad thing for? People selling the good, so we see producer surplus go down. And then what about this area here? Well, this used to be producer and consumer surplus, but these units are no longer being provided to the market, so nobody can buy them if they're not being produced. All of the surplus here is lost, or this would represent our deadweight loss, right? That's our loss of surplus because we're no longer seeing these units being sold. For all the units that are still being sold, we still have the same amount of surplus as before. It's just that more of that surplus is going to consumers than it is to producers. Okay. Any questions on this before we jump back to the slides? Okay. All right. So here we'll kind of work through a rent control example. I'll mention some of the same things that I had up there before, although I will introduce one additional thing. So here we've got a rent control example where the current equilibrium price and quantity is what? $1,000, and there's 2 million apartments being rented, right? Produced and consumed. After rent control, so rent control is an effective price ceiling, right? So we had consumer surplus before, area below demand but above the price. producer surplus, area below the price, but above the supply curve. So here would be total economic surplus, the sum of those two things. After this price ceiling, say they lowered rent, you can only charge up to $800. You can't charge the old equilibrium price of 1,000, only 800. Well, what is producer surplus? It's going to be the area below that price, but above the supply curve. So we can see here, producer surpluses went down, but we said consumer surplus, the area below the demand curve, but above that new price, that's going to be this blue and purple area. Now the blue area, it was consumer surplus before. This purple area represents what used to be producer surplus and is now consumer surplus. And then all of these 0.2 million apartments that are no longer being produced or supplied to the market, we're losing out all of that economic surplus. So that would be our deadweight loss. Okay. It's just another visual kind of way of thinking about what's happening to consumer, producer surplus, and deadweight loss. Okay. All right. We already talked about ineffective versus effective price ceilings. So a couple of things that effective price ceilings will do, we've already talked about. It has to be set below the equilibrium price. It's then going to lower the price. It's going to reduce quantity. It could cause black markets, and it is going to cause shortages, and I'll give you a depiction of that in a second. If it is an ineffective price ceiling, nothing's going to happen, right? Everything stays exactly the same. Okay. So before I jump to thinking about why it's causing a shortage, well, actually, yeah, we'll do that now. So let's say we have, and I know I'm going to rehash some of the same ideas, but I think hearing it slightly different ways might click with some people one way and not the other. So I think it's good that we get a couple different variations. So here's our equilibrium price. Here was kind of the old equilibrium quantity. Remember, without any government intervention, that equilibrium quantity, the quantity supplied was exactly the same as the quantity demanded. When I set this effective price ceiling, we said nobody's willing to supply it past this quantity now. So our quantity supplied at this price is going to be much lower than the quantity demanded. So when our quantity demanded was greater than our quantity supplied, we said we had a shortage in terms of the number of units. Now, I said it can also create black markets, and I probably wouldn't push you quite as far as what I'm going to do next in terms of quiz questions or exam questions. But let's think about why a black market could exist. So let's say we had this rent example. I think previously with like 2 million apartments and then 1.8 after that price ceiling. Well, everybody here is still willing to pay a price higher than the current rent control of 800. So when we impose this price ceiling, it might have sounded like a good idea because, oh yeah, everyone who has an apartment, they're now paying a lower amount of money, right? We're helping out people. However, what about these people here? There's now 0.2 million people without an apartment to rent. No one's willing to rent to them. That's, homelessness, right? We don't have a place to live. Now, what could occur if I rent my apartment not through legal means, I kind of do this all under the table, I don't report this as income, well, notice how much would somebody be willing to pay for an apartment here? Excuse me, this amount. So possibly what could occur is we have a black market where this product is illegally sold at prices higher than what is set by the government. And in fact, a lot of the times, and we'll talk more about market power stuff in future modules, but a lot of times there's only like one person or one producer. So we have like a monopoly. So not only do they end up paying a price higher than the price ceiling, producers know they can charge consumers exactly what their marginal benefit is. So they end up charging these people prices that are higher than they would have paid if we would have just left this market alone and allowed it to be in equilibrium. So because these people still want to buy this good and their marginal benefit is still above the actual cost to producers, as long as they can find those people and sell to them illegally under the table so that the government, doesn't know they're breaking this law, we still might see a black market exist. Okay. All right. Any questions there? So just seeing this once again in a slightly different way. Let's say I had a market in equilibrium. This would be my current consumer surplus, the area below demand, but above that equilibrium price. So area A, B, and E would represent consumer surplus. Producer surplus, the area below price but of the supply curve, C, D, and F. Right? Total surplus, this entire triangle. After a price ceiling, right, if it's effective, notice here we had the quantity supplied is below the quantity demanded at that new price, so we have a shortage, right? Consumer surplus will be the area below demand up to this new quantity. So this quantity supplied, that ends up being the new quantity in the market, because with a price ceiling, if no one's willing to supply it past this point, nobody can buy it. So A, B, and C will be now consumer surplus, the area below demand but above the price. So notice it used to be A, B, and E. So consumers lost this little area E, but what used to be producer surplus is now going to consumers. Once again, kind of intuitive. If I lower the price, that's going to benefit consumers. What is producer surplus? It's no longer C, F, and D. After this price ceiling, the area below price but below the supply curve is only this area D. So producer surpluses went down. And then what was lost? Well, all of these units are no longer being sold. So our deadweight loss is just going to be this little triangle here. E represents part of deadweight loss that came from consumers. F is the part of deadweight loss that came from producers. Okay. So just another way of getting at the same concepts. So how do we do this if we add some actual values to this? Stay on. All right, sorry. These lights are giving me fits. So if I had this market and it was currently in equilibrium, supply would be equal to demand at $50 and at a quantity of 40. So what would my consumer surplus be? Area above price, below the demand curve. That's a triangle, a height, 90 to 50, so 40. Goes from 0 to 40, so 40 times a half would be 800. After this price ceiling is imposed, what is consumer surplus? Well, area below demand but above the price. It's now the area of this triangle and this rectangle. So I do what? 30 times the new quantity is 30, so 30 times a half, plus the area of this rectangle, which is what? 20 times 30. So 20 times 30 is the rectangle, 30 times a half is that triangle. That would be my total consumer surplus. So what has happened to consumer surplus? It's went up by 250. So notice they lost a little bit here, but they gained even more here. Right? So overall, consumer surplus went up. What about producer surplus? Well, before, the area below price but above the supply curve, that triangle is what? 40 times a half. So we started out with this example where consumer and producer surplus were exactly the same. Okay. After this price ceiling, the new producer surplus, the area below the new price and above the supply curve, is this smaller green triangle. So 30 times a half. We see from this price ceiling, producer surplus doesn't go up, it actually goes down. Okay. Now notice, how much did producer surplus fall by? Looks like what? 350? Consumer surplus only went up by 250. So what happened to that extra $100 that was lost from producers? Well, remember, we still haven't calculated the fact that we aren't seeing those units from 30 to 40 being supplied anymore. No one can buy them. This red area would represent our deadweight loss. So we can calculate the area of that triangle. What? 20 times 10 times a half, or that's where that missing $100 was. Now you can also do it another way. I could just compare total surplus before and after. So notice total surplus before was what? 1,600. Total surplus after, adding up producer and consumer surplus, would be 1,500. So what's the difference between the two? that loss of $100 of surplus or economic surplus. Okay. So this is how we would kind of work through examples with some values to them. Okay. Any other questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So we had price ceilings. Price floors are going to be very, very similar. It's just everything kind of gets flipped. So a price floor is going to be where we don't allow the price to go below a certain value, right? Or it's a floor. I can't put the price any lower, right? So examples of this, we'll go through a minimum wage example later. That's probably the most common example we see of it. But there could be other industries where if the government wants to make sure that the price is higher than what the current equilibrium is, they'll set an effective price floor. So it's not going to cause a shortage in units. It's going to cause a surplus in units. But it's a government action, so it still pushes us out of the equilibrium as long as it's effective. So it's going to still create some deadweight loss. And it has to be effective. It's the reverse of a price ceiling. It has to be set above the equilibrium price. And then if we do set it below, that would be an ineffective price floor. Okay. So I'll walk through an example, and before we look at kind of the slides here, think about what is this price? Oh, so we've got quantity, price. Here's my supply curve. Here's my demand curve. Here's the current equilibrium price. Here is the current equilibrium quantity. So if I come in and I tell people, you know, here's the price floor. So if they were currently charging 40 and I tell them you can't charge a price below, sorry, previously charging 50, and I tell them you can't sell at a price below 40, what do they tell me? I'm not, right? So if we set the price floor below the equilibrium, it would be ineffective. The only way it's going to be an effective price floor is if we set it somewhere above that current equilibrium price, because now we say the lowest price you can charge is 70, it can't get down to that old equilibrium price. So that was where we had effective price floors. Okay. If we have an effective price floor, right, so using this idea, what impacts is that going to have on our economic surplus? So here's supply, here is demand. Right? Let's say they come in, set this effective, oops, no, I'm doing this backwards. Hold on. I'm looking at my other graph here, not thinking about what I'm doing. So I want not a price ceiling. We are now moving on to price floors. So we've got supply, demand, and I want an effective price floor. Okay. So what's going to happen? Well, we can kind of visualize this, but here was our old equilibrium price. So before, this was going to be consumer surplus, was this entire triangle. Now, at every point past this quantity, the new price, which is the marginal cost to consumers, is now above. Remember, the demand curve tells us their marginal benefit, so it's above their marginal benefit. All of these units, right? So this is like after the price floor. Consumers are no longer going to be willing to buy these units. So what is consumer surplus? It's the area below demand, but above price. So our consumer surplus with a price floor has actually went down. Producer surplus used to be this triangle, the area below price but above supply. Now at this higher price, producer surplus, the area below that price and above the supply curve, they lost a little bit here, but they gained a lot more from the units that they were still selling. So here, the reverse of a price ceiling, price floors will decrease consumer surplus, increase producer surplus. Once again, kind of intuitive. If we raise the price, it's a bad thing for consumers, good thing for producers. And we're no longer seeing any of these units being consumed or produced in the market anymore. So we're also going to have a loss of surplus or deadweight loss. Okay. Now, with price ceilings, we said the new price after the price ceiling was because suppliers didn't want to supply as much as they were before. With price floors, this quantity was actually the quantity demanded after the price floor. At this higher price, what would the quantity supplied be? Much higher. So now here, if the quantity demanded is below the quantity supplied, we would say we have a surplus. And here, we don't want to get confused with economic surplus. So I always say we have a surplus in the number of units with a price floor. Okay. So looks pretty similar to price ceilings, just everything kind of goes in the opposite direction, right? Because we're now not lowering the price, now we're increasing it. Okay. All right. Where are we at on time? So just to make sure, I've got some extra stuff that I'll save to the end. But just seeing this in a slightly different way, kind of like we did for price ceilings. If I have a price floor, before that price floor, consumer surplus is the area below demand above price. So A, B, and E. We said producer surplus, area below price above supply, CDF. Here's my total surplus. After an effective price floor, we said the new quantity demanded is going to dictate the quantity in the market. At that higher price, quantity supply would be higher, so we've got a surplus in the number of units. Consumer surplus will now only be the area above that new price, but below the demand curve, so it's now only area A. So compared to before, A, B, and E, consumers lost out on area B and E. Well, producers at this higher price, what is their surplus? The area below that price, but above the supply curve. So they've kept area C and D, gained area B, but they lost a little bit here. Right? So as long as that gain in area B is greater than what they is greater than what they lost in area F, then producers are better off. And then what does E and F represent? This is the deadweight loss from the fact that we are now seeing fewer units being produced and consumed in the market. E came from consumers, area F came from producers. Okay. So part of producer and consumer surplus will be lost. So part of deadweight loss, will be from consumers, part will be from producers. But there will also be a transfer of surplus with price floors from consumers to producers, or exact reverse of a price ceiling. Okay. Want to put some values to this, right? We might think about the exact same scenario we had before. So this equilibrium price and quantity, it's the same as the example we used before. So if we calculated consumer surplus, the area above price below demand, that triangle 40 times 40 times a half was 800. After the price floor, consumers now pay a higher price. So now our consumer surplus is only the area underneath demand and above this new high price of 60. So what, 30 times the new quantity of 30 times a half. Now consumer surplus, when we have a price floor, has now decreased. What's happened to producer surplus? Well, at this higher price, producer surplus, the area underneath that price but above the supply curve. So we have the area of a rectangle, 20 times 30, plus the area of this triangle, 30 times a half. So we went before where we had producer surplus of 800. Now with a price floor, it's gone up to 1,050. So similar to kind of before, what's deadweight loss? Well, we can do two ways. What was consumer producer surplus before? So that's a total economic surplus of 800 plus 800 is 1,600. What is it after the price floor? Consumer plus producer surplus would be what? 1,500, so we lost $100. Or if we can identify on the graph visually, it's the area of this triangle, right? It's the surplus lost in the market, the difference between the demand and the supply curve, for all of these units, these 10 units that are no longer being produced and consumed in the market. So that would be what? 20 times 10 times a half. Sure enough, it's that same value of 100 if we just compared total surplus before and after. Okay. All right. Any questions on that? So I think that should here I kind of already talked through effective price floors and price ceiling. Here's just a slide where it kind of reminds you, it is somewhat counterintuitive, but an effective price floor or a binding price floor has to be set above the equilibrium price, and an effective price ceiling or a binding price ceiling has to be set below the equilibrium. Okay. So I've got a minimum wage example. Where are we at in time? I have one other thing that I wanted to do, and then also that participation quiz. So with this idea that a price floor or a price ceiling could be binding, it kind of seems like dumb at first. Like, why would the government impose something if it's not effective? Well, let's think about if I had a market, and let's say that got my supply curve, got my demand curve. What do I want here? We'll go back and think about a price ceiling. So let's say I have a price ceiling here. If it's set below the current equilibrium price, it's binding or it's effective, right? So if this was the case, what is it going to do? It's going to lower that quantity, right? We're going to have some dead weight loss, right? Now, what happens in this market, time progresses if we were to see a demand decrease. So let's say, I don't know, we see a decrease in income and this is a normal good. Right? So we get a decrease in demand. Where would the new equilibrium price and quantity be? Well, now my new equilibrium price would be here. Now this would be an ineffective price ceiling, right? So this would now become ineffective because the current price is 30 and you're telling me I can't charge a price any higher than 40. Okay, I'm not, right? So the idea is that, there's time lags on when the government does something, and that potentially something that used to be effective after a demand or supply shift could become ineffective or vice versa. All right. Any other questions on this idea? Okay. So I'll revisit minimum wages at the end of class. I want to pull this open, and I'm not going to have it published once again. I'll publish as soon as class is over because you can't really have the lockdown on and still access Zoom. So I will walk you through these. So if you're watching this live, you'll still be able to answer these very quickly and hopefully easily as soon as class is over. But here's some types of problems you could see on the exam, quizzes, right? Should look pretty similar to some of the stuff that we've actually even done here in class today. So we'll get this up here. So let's say I have a market that looks like this. Now, before we even read the question, if this was a price floor, what's going to happen? Well, if I set a price floor below the equilibrium, you tell people you can't charge a price below 30. They're currently charging 50. They say, okay, I'm not. Nothing's going to change. So hopefully this question says this is a price ceiling. Yes, right? So if this is a price ceiling, then it says you can't charge a price higher than 30. This is going to be effective or binding. So how would I calculate consumer surplus after this price ceiling? Well, remember, consumer surplus is the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to consumers. What's their marginal benefit? Represented by the demand curve. What's their marginal cost? Whatever the price is. However, we only go up to this 20th unit because after the price ceiling, no supplier is willing to supply any unit past that 20th one. So here's our new quantity after the price ceiling. Consumers, the area below demand but above this new price. We've got the area of a rectangle, so that's going to be what? 40 times 20, so that's what? 800, plus the area of this triangle, 20 times 20 times a half is 200. 200 plus 800 should give us that consumer surplus of 1,000. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. Now, same kind of setup. If we have this price ceiling, what's going to happen to producer surplus and deadweight loss? Well, we know that anytime we have a price ceiling, just using intuition, that's going to lower the price. A lower price is a good thing for who? Consumers, so consumer surplus should go up. It's a bad thing for producers. So we should see that producer surplus decreases. We could prove that to ourselves. So once again, what was producer surplus before this price ceiling? Would be the area below price but above supply. So what, 40 times a half? So what, 800? After the price ceiling, it would be the area below that new price but above supply. So what, 20 times a half? So that would only be 200. So producer surplus is definitely decreased. Right? Now, what's happened to deadweight loss? What is deadweight loss when the market's at equilibrium? Zero. So we start out with a deadweight loss of zero. Total economic surplus is maximized. After this price ceiling, we're no longer seeing these units from 20 to 40. So for the market, the area in between its marginal benefits and its marginal cost is just the area in between the supply and demand curve. So we're looking at, for all these 20 units, what's the area lost in between supply and demand? So that triangle would be what? 40 times 20 times a half. So it should be 400. So we went from a deadweight loss of zero to a deadweight loss of 400. Okay. So deadweight loss increases. This question is even easier than what I was making it out to be, but just kind of, trying to add some stuff in there, how I could change this to have you make an actual calculation. Okay. So producer surplus decreases, deadweight loss will increase with an effective price ceiling. What if instead I had a price floor set at 70? So if I set this price floor at 70, what's the value of deadweight loss? Well, now it won't be supply that's limiting the quantity. Now at this higher price, for any unit past 20, consumers are not willing to buy this good because their marginal benefit is now below that marginal cost or that price. So the new quantity will be dictated not by producers now, but by consumers. Now we still are getting it down to this quantity of 20. So notice, whether it's a price ceiling that gets my quantity to 20, we said deadweight loss there was 400. If I had a price floor that limited my quantity to 20, well, what is the loss of surplus? It's the same 20 units, 20 to 40. It's going to be the exact same triangle. So what? 40 times 20 times a half, I would still have the same deadweight loss because it's the same units that aren't being sold. So we can actually have the same deadweight loss from a price floor and a price ceiling. Now, those price floors and price ceilings are different values, right? They're being set at different points, but I could see a deadweight loss created for the exact same amount from a price ceiling as a price floor. Okay. And then the last one, this one should be pretty easy, but I wanted to kind of add it in there to highlight we always need to make sure we're checking one thing first. If I have a price floor of 30, the first thing I should check is whether or not that's effective or ineffective, or whether or not it's binding. So if I have a price floor at 30, I'm telling people you can't charge a price any lower than this, what's going to happen? Well, I'm not currently charging a price below 30, I'm only charging 50, so nothing. So what's going to happen to producer, consumer, surplus, and deadweight loss? Well, the market doesn't change, so everything remains exactly the same. So their producer surplus and deadweight loss, because we have an ineffective price floor here set below the current equilibrium, nothing's going to happen. All right. All right. So this will be the quiz that I will set to release as soon as I'm done with this recording today. It will require that lockdown browser. So you'll see it pop up under this module 5 and 6 as soon as we're done today. Okay. All right. Any questions before I kind of do this last example? So the minimum wage is really a fancy well, I shouldn't say fancy. It is it's just a slightly different example, a different market of the use of a price floor. Um, so we'll talk through why it's going to cause, change in the quantity of labor, et cetera. We'll kind of build this out. I'll then try to give you kind of an argument for why minimum wages are a good thing. But we'll kind of have a lengthier discussion with some graphs associated with it, so it makes it a little bit easier to see. So let's say I'm thinking about a market. Typically, I would think about here's my quantity, here's my price, here's my supply curve, here's my demand curve. Okay. So if instead we're not looking at the market for a product, but we're looking at the labor market, we can think of this as like the quantity of labor or number of workers. Now you can do this like in terms of the number of labor hours. Just for the sake of our discussion, I think it'll be a little bit easier if we think about the quantity of labor as just the number of workers. And then maybe instead of the price here, we think of the price of labor as wage, right? The wages. Now, you could do this as an hourly wage rate. That's where we're thinking about a minimum wage. You could also think about when you set a minimum wage, typically you're thinking about people work 40 hours. And so maybe you're kind of setting what the minimum weekly wage rate would be based off of a 40-hour work week. So if we currently had, this is our equilibrium wage, what's the only way a minimum wage makes sense? Well, if we come in and put it somewhere above whatever the current wage is. Right? So a minimum wage, in order to be effective, we would have to say you can't charge a wage below this, and the current wage would have to be below it. That is a effective price floor. That's all a minimum wage is. So it raises the wage. Before, here was my kind of equilibrium quantity of labor. Where is it now? Well, now for every worker past this point, the marginal benefit of that worker to the company is below the marginal cost, which is the wage to the company. So here's where it also gets kind of weird. Who is my consumer, or who is demanding labor? Companies. Who is supplying labor? Workers, or, right, you and me, right? So it's kind of weird because usually we think of these product markets, it's always easy to think about ourselves as consumers because we buy things every day. In the labor market, you and I are quite often, we are the suppliers of labor, right? So what's going to happen with this higher minimum wage? Well, who is that going to be a good thing for? We set a price floor if it raises the price, in this case, raises the wage. That's going to be a bad thing for consumers, right? They're paying a higher price or a higher wage. Good thing for producers. Well, who are the producers? You and me. That's why typically we think of the minimum wage benefits workers. Who is it a bad thing for? The consumers of labor, which are companies. Okay. So at this higher wage rate, the marginal benefit of all these workers is now below the marginal cost. So the new quantity demanded for labor, or the new quantity after this minimum wage, is going to be lower than it was before. What's happened to consumer surplus? Well, it's now the area below demand, but above price or above the wage. Whereas producer surplus, the area below the price or below the wage and above the supply curve. So we can kind of see it's the exact same model we were working at before. It's just instead of the price of a good, we're talking about the price of labor, which is typically called wages. Now, this is a good thing for all these people here, because they are now working, and instead of getting this lower wage, they're getting this higher wage rate. Right? So producer surplus or worker surplus has went up. But what's happened here? What do these people represent? If this was the number of workers being hired before, this is the number of workers after. This is essentially unemployment, right? All of this would represent the loss of surplus And here it's not because there aren't units being produced and consumed in the market, it's because there aren't workers being employed in the market. So we would have deadweight loss. And really, what does that look like in practice? That's because people are losing their job. Now, you could also break this down. Maybe they don't get fired, or maybe they don't lose their job. If instead of the number of workers, we were looking at this like in an hourly quantity of labor was hourly, maybe they don't fire workers, but they limit their hours, which is still, not a great thing for those workers, right? And we're still seeing some kind of deadweight loss there. But if we think about it in terms of the number of workers, we could see this create unemployment. Okay. Excuse me. Any questions about that? I've got one more thing. We're talking about efficiency wages here that we'll kind of add in that makes this a little bit trickier. But really, a minimum wage is just a price floor, right? And the price of the product we're looking at, we just call wage. So it's a little bit different. So once again, I probably wouldn't push you this far in a quiz or an exam, but I want to try to show you how all of what we're talking about can be combined and to have a little bit more real world application, right? So I accidentally hit my mouse there. There we go. Let's say I've got a minimum wage example. Something like this. Here was kind of my old equilibrium wage. And let's say here's my new minimum wage. And we kind of talked through, okay, that's going to cause deadweight loss, limit the quantity, right? So this would be, something we don't like. Okay. Now, what could occur? So there's an argument, and there's some support for this as well. And if we don't think about it even in terms of the number of workers, but the number of hours, if I'm going to a job, so I went to the grocery store this weekend, I'm thinking about like a lot of, I used to work at a grocery store, stocking. So I made like just above, I don't even know, I think it was just above minimum wage. But let's assume I was getting, paid $5 an hour or something. And all of a sudden there's a minimum wage and I'm now getting paid 10. Well, for everybody who keeps their job, right, we said that could cause some unemployment, but workers who are being paid what they now view as like a suitable wage, maybe they work a little bit harder, right? Maybe when they show up to work, they don't, I don't know, steal some of the product. Maybe they, don't try to cut corners because they have, they feel like they're in it with their employer now. They feel like they almost owe their employer, they're getting paid more, they've got to work harder. Well, what does work harder mean? To an employer, remember, who is benefiting from hiring a worker? So this was the quantity of labor, or we said we could think about the number of workers, right? And this was our kind of wages. Well, the marginal benefit to a company when they hire you is how much additional product, right, or how much additional revenue you can earn them. Well, you can think of this as higher quality workers, I'm going to have a higher demand for because they add a higher additional amount of output to my company. So if paying someone a minimum wage increases, here I'll use blue, their quality of work, that would actually increase the demand curve. Try to draw this perfect, but it's a little bit off. There we go. Make a large enough circle, then I drew it right? So if being paid this minimum wage, which initially looks like it's going to cause unemployment, causes workers in these minimum wage jobs to work harder and be more beneficial to the companies are now willing to pay them a higher amount. Notice, where's my new equilibrium point? At that minimum wage, and this new like equilibrium quantity, even with the minimum wage now, it doesn't cause there to be a reduction in quantity. We end up at a quantity that's even higher than the old equilibrium. So the argument for things like a minimum wage, especially when it comes to workers, is that if in any way it can also create an additional or kind of increase the effectiveness of my workers, then maybe the minimum wage isn't going to cause unemployment. it actually causes even more employment than before. Okay. So another thing there, you pay workers more, maybe they can go search or they will search more for additional training, additional education, different programs within the corporation to kind of help improve what their skill level is, increase that demand curve. Now that minimum wage, in fact, could be, if it shifted this enough, maybe now we start to see old jobs that used to just pay the minimum wage. If this shifted enough, the new equilibrium is going to be above that minimum wage. Maybe now that minimum wage becomes ineffective, right? So I think there, I would argue there's probably a lot of jobs like this where once they kind of start paying their workers this minimum wage, potentially see they see this shift in demand, and that minimum wage is no longer binding, right? And then you see them start to pay a wage that's above the minimum wage, and people don't view it as just a minimum wage job. So I don't know. I think it's kind of an interesting part of the discussion with the minimum wage, that if it does cause any shifts, increases in demand, that potentially this could lead to our new equilibrium being at that minimum wage and not causing unemployment. Okay. So $15 minimum wage, if it doesn't cause those shifts, unemployment everywhere, right? And we kind of this. We'll start with quotas next class. We'll then talk through taxes and subsidies. So next class is basically finishing out module 6. We'll still be talking about surplus values, taxes and subsidies. Other than that, I think that should wrap it up for today. Any questions before I end the recording? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. Not really that related to, or well, it's kind of related to what we're talking about, but it's kind of like not today's topic.
Yeah.
It does this model like in the future, right? If we learn about inflation, does that take into account into like this model?
So you're thinking about that if I set a minimum wage, yeah. So remember, when we're analyzing these cause and effects, we're essentially assuming everything else is being held constant. So if you had,
Ah, okay.
yeah, right. So if you had inflation, that could cause minimum wages to become ineffective or effective. Why? Because there's something changing that is shifting the supply and demand curve. So if that minimum wage, um, prices are higher, when I'm a company selling a product, if I can now sell for more money, I'm willing to pay my workers a higher wage, even if, just because of
Okay.
inflation. And so then we would see increases in the demand curve. Then the minimum wage is no longer effective. And that's why, in order for it to be an effective minimum wage, what would we need to do? We would need to constantly be updating the minimum wage to keep up with inflation, or essentially keep up with these demand shifts, right?
So
Uh,
basically inflation is constantly moving the supply and demand curve.
Exactly. And it
Ah,
really,
okay.
you would want to think about it more so. I mean, this is a little bit into the weeds. It's a good question, but it's probably like the next level of micro.
Yeah,
But yeah,
yeah, yeah.
you'd be like shifting the demand curve would constantly be increasing because of inflation, because the demand curve in the labor market is a byproduct of how much you can sell your good for. So if how much you can sell your good for goes up, your workers are essentially worth more to you, right? Because they're now
All
creating a
right.
product that you can sell for more. So yeah, it's basically like that demand curve, because of inflation, just keeps increasing. So what would we need to do in order to make the minimum wage effective? You would have to consistently be increasing it, which is why a lot of the times
Okay.
they'll even write thing, if the government was effective, they would have a schedule that would keep up, set a minimum wage, but then update it accordingly, like even periodically every month, to keep up with whatever your inflation, whatever index you're using for prices. But that's why, because sometimes it's more just like, oh, we passed minimum wage. Well, if it's 10 years old, you got to update it, right? Otherwise, it's not
I
effective
see.
anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I was just
Okay.
curious.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. Any other questions here before I end the recording? Okay.